back to A Bit of Thought, the podcast. I'm AJ.
I'm Elizabeth.
We really appreciate you joining us today for this special edition Christmas
Edition.
Christmas special episode. Let's do it.
All right, let's go ahead. Let's start with an icebreaker question. What's your favorite movie?
Like, in general?
Christmas movie. Christmas. This is Christmas edition. So what's your favorite Christmas movie?
Okay, yeah. So I don't even have to think about that one. It's Home Alone.
I knew it.
Definitely Home Alone. I like both Home Alone 1 and Home Alone 2. But, Home Alone holds a special place in my heart. But I also love 2 because it's set in New York.
In New York, yeah.
I love it, yeah. And that reminds me, there's this, like these memes going around on social media where people are like comparing the old man. I think his name is Old Man Maury or something. I forget his exact name, but it's the old man in the first movie that ends up helping Kevin at the end, and the wet bandits are trying to basically kidnap him.
Yeah.
And they're kind of like saying that there's parallels between him and Jesus.
Yeah.
And I've seen a couple of them, and I can see where people are coming from, but personally, I think that's a little bit of a stretch.
Really?
There's definitely some parallels, but yeah, I don't think that analogy works very well. Now, there is one that I do think works, and it's that Jesus is actually the original Kevin McAllister. Yeah, because if you read in Luke, so Luke chapter 2, verses 41 through 49, and I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. It says, "Now every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents were unaware of this." So he's in Jerusalem. They're on their way back home to Nazareth, but they weren't aware. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. So they had already traveled a day's journey out of Jerusalem towards Nazareth when they realized that, hold on, where's Jesus?
Like the
little boy Jesus. Then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends, because back, the trips from different parts of Israel to Jerusalem for the festivals, people would travel in caravans or in groups to, sort of prevent being robbed on the way there, because it was very common to be robbed on your way to and from Jerusalem. So they would travel as groups with friends and family, to protect each other. When they did not find them, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. And one of my favorite verses in this story is actually 46. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions, So even the boy Jesus,
ask
questions, which is a common theme in our podcast.
Yes.
Ask questions, inquire, be inquisitive. But anyways, I thought that was funny because it's literally the kind of the same
story
situation with Kevin McAllister, where they're getting ready to go to, in the first one, to Paris, and then the second one to Florida. And in the first one, particularly, they think that he's with them all the way until they get to Paris, and they start looking for him. They're passing the bag down, and they're like, give this to Kevin, until they realize Kevin's not here. Anyways, I thought that was funny. How about you? What's your favorite?
Actually, no, that's in the second one.
Is that in the second one?
Yes, in the first one, she realizes while they're on the plane.
Oh, you're right.
So that's really more of a parallel to Jesus' story.
They're both, yeah.
Mary realizes while they're on their way out.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. Then she's like, imagine her thinking Jesus.
Yeah, I could see that, like Mary doing that, Jesus, falling back.
That's fun. That's real cute.
How about you? What is your favorite?
Well, mine, I think, would be more Home Alone 2 than 1. I feel like I really like Home Alone 2 a little bit more, only because it's set in New York. Obviously, I'm from New York, and it's just so iconic. I've seen like people try to replicate the spots that he goes to in New York City during Christmas time.
That's
cute, yeah.
And he went on 2023, at the end of 2023.
No.
Yeah, at the end of 2023.
So
What
that's really cute.
we,
And
we
then
got to visit a few of the landmarks
yeah,
from Home Alone,
the plaza.
the Plaza, Central Park. So it's definitely those two movies will always hold a special place.
No,
They have so many childhood memories with those two movies.
yeah.
Yeah. All right, but
All right.
anyways, let's
Let's
get
get
into.
into today's episode. So we titled it Good News for All People. But before we start, we want to have just like in our previous episodes, some clarification of terms. So we only have two today. So we're going to start with Hellenistic, Hellenized, or Hellenization. What does that mean?
So those terms refer to the practice of adopting or spreading of Greek language, culture, customs, or ways of thinking. Alexander the Great, his conquests, not only was he conquering other territories, other kingdoms, but at the same time, he was also spreading Greek language, culture, and ideas to the Eastern Mediterranean area and the Near East. So those areas where Israel is, Babylon, Persia, places like that. He deeply Hellenized the ancient world and reshaped it to the point where during Jesus' time, the world that he is going to live and die in is a world that's highly influenced by Greek culture.
Okay.
Yeah, and remember in our last episode, we talked about how the ancient Israelites preserved their culture by preserving their scriptures
Mm-hmm.
and by editing or redacting those scriptures to reflect their new realities.
Okay.
So this is getting into what's called theology. So if you follow theology in the scriptures, from the Hebrew scriptures into the Christian scriptures, you can actually see that pattern where it goes from being like a very ancient Canaanite style religion. They developed their own religious systems, and then during the time of Jesus, once we enter the New Testament, you can see the effects that Hellenization has had on that area, that territory.
Okay. All right. The second term we have is Second Temple Period.
Yes. So Second Temple period. It's a period that's named after the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. So remember, the temple gets destroyed by the Babylonians.
Mm.
And then once Israel is once again invaded by the Persians, King Cyrus the Great allows them to return to Israel to rebuild the temple. In the Bible, you can read about this in books like Ezra and Nehemiah. And actually, very interesting fact is that Isaiah 45:1 refers to Cyrus, King Cyrus the Great, as God's anointed one, because the Israelites had a lot of respect and appreciation towards him for allowing them to return to the land to rebuild their temple.
Okay. All right. So to begin, since the dawn of humanity, there's no doubt that countless stories have been told. They've been written and ultimately passed along. Some, though certainly not all of these stories, become timeless. They're no longer limited by location or time. What causes certain stories to enter our collective memories and endure the passing of time? As we discussed in our last episode, what makes a cultural icon endure? In order to survive the passage of time, stories need to be told and retold, redacted, edited, and even reinvented so that they remain relevant and speak to the changing realities of the cultures invested in preserving and transmitting them into the future.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Now, before stories become timeless, they must first speak to their original audience in a way that makes them not only interesting stories, but inspiring, hopeful, relevant, and meaningful.
Okay.
Because if you think about it, if stories wouldn't resonate with their original audience, then what would be the point of preserving them, right? Something about a story and how it connects to the original audience inspires the people that received that story to preserve it and transmit it to future generations, right? Obviously, there's been more stories written that haven't withstood the test of time. That's what we want to explore today, right? What causes stories to become timeless?
Okay.
And I think there's no better example of a story that becomes timeless, part of humanity's collective mindset, than the birth of Jesus. It's become part of the broader human experience. It's a story that quite literally changed how we keep track of time, at least in our part of the world. And it's a story that has endured the test of time and cemented itself as a definitive narrative of hope, inspiration, and meaning.
Yes, that's true. So in today's episode, we want to focus on the qualities of this story that would have resonated with its original audience, which were the early Christians living towards the end of the first century. These were the people who first heard this story, whether it was read aloud to them or if they were fortunate and educated enough to read them by themselves. What elements of the story would have caused the original listener to say, that makes sense, or this man from Nazareth was really special? What makes this story good news for all people?
So in this episode, what we're going to be looking at is specifically Matthew's birth narrative,
Okay.
as we plan to discuss Luke's birth narrative in our next episode, which will come out in the next few weeks. Now, before we get into it, I do want to set some things clear at the outset. We're not exploring historical plausibility or historical accuracy of these birth narratives. There is a lot that can be said about the questions surrounding the accuracy of the events as described in the birth narratives. But that's not our focus today. What I want to focus on is the story itself as we find it in the New Testament, particularly the Gospel according to Matthew, and ask what his story would have meant to its original first century audience, keeping in mind that they did not see or understand history the way that we do today. In addition to that, we're not going to mash the stories of Matthew and Luke together. So we're not going to take the two birth narratives and mash them together to create one big birth narrative. We're going to leave that to, Christmas pageants, Christmas shows, and Christmas sermons. Our goal is to read and explore each narrative on its own terms, respecting each author and their intentions. I believe that this is the best way to understand each story and the meaning the author was trying to convey. When we don't do this, when we try to make Matthew and Luke say the same thing, we're no longer reading the Gospel according to Matthew or the Gospel according to Luke. What you end up reading is the Gospel according to you. So a way to respect the authors is by respecting the story as an individual story. Now, I'm not criticizing Christmas in any way whatsoever. If you know me at all, you know that Christmas is my absolute favorite time of the year. I love the holiday. I love everything about it. The lights, the festivities, the shows, the movies, everything about it. But what we're doing here is we're not engaging in festivities. We're engaging in understanding the text. And to do that, you have to respect the author and the author's intentions.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, I just don't think that you, I, or anyone listening to this is as interesting as the authors of Matthew and Luke's Gospels. So let's let them speak for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I like that. So today we'll be exploring 3 elements from Matthew's birth narrative. First, it's going to be the genealogy of Jesus, the Star of Bethlehem, and the Magi from the East.
Yes, so we're going to start with the genealogy of Jesus, which we find in Matthew chapter 1. You'll see that the author traces Jesus' genealogy all the way back to Abraham. And this is important for a few reasons. One reason we're going to explore now, and another reason we're going to explore later in the episode.
Okay.
If you've ever taken the time to read the Bible or the biblical text, you're going to recall that Abraham was called by God out of Mesopotamia and promised him land, descendants, and blessings. The blessing that God promises to Abraham is wide-reaching and extends beyond just Israel. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, it says that through him, that is, through Abraham, God will bless all the families of the earth, which is just another way of saying everyone,
Okay.
everybody.
So why are genealogies important, especially in the ancient world?
Good question. Now, genealogies play an important role in ancient biographies, or lives, as they were often called back then. So they didn't call them biographies the way they do, they called them lives, like life of such and such, or the lives of such and such.
Yeah.
Now, they're important for a few reasons. One of them is because they establish pedigree, so to speak. A genealogy sets the foundation for why the figure being discussed was important and worthy of attention. Most biographies from that period would mention the subject's father in only in passing. However, if the subject was a king or an emperor, the genealogy would be far more detailed, sometimes tracing the individual's origins back to an ancient king or ruler. In some cases, such as with Alexander the Great or the Roman Emperor Galba, ancestry was traced all the way back to a god. The author of Matthew, I personally think, intentionally chooses to provide a robust genealogy of Jesus, much like other ancient writers did for kings, rulers, and other very important figures. This is not an accident.
Yeah, like almost the first entire chapter, it's all...
Well, the whole first
The
chapter,
whole first
pretty
chapter.
much, yeah, it's taken up by his genealogy. This isn't an accident, like I said. I think the author wants to connect Jesus to Israel's great king, King David. About halfway down the genealogy, this is what he does. And he also wants to establish Jesus' pedigree right from the outset. So not only is Jesus a descendant of Abraham, the man through whom God promised to bless the entire world, but he is also a descendant of King David, the greatest king of Israel. Again, we're not going to concern ourselves with questions of historicity here. If you've ever read the genealogy, you'll realize that there are some issues that can be explored, but that's not our focus here today. We want to look at the story itself, the way it is being told by the author.
So this sounds like something that would be important to the Jewish audience at the time, but how about those who would have listened or read Matthew's gospel and were not Jewish?
So up to this point, the character of Jesus as presented in the gospel according to Matthew would strongly resonate with Jewish readers, as you said. He is descended not only from Abraham, Israel's ancient ancestor, the ancestral starting point of Israel's covenant with God, but he's also descended from King David, Israel's greatest king. Now, if you're listening to Matthew's gospel or reading it back then, and you happen to be a non-Jewish person, this genealogy would resonate with you as well. Because, like I mentioned, it points back to the promise God made to Abraham that through him, all the families of the earth would be blessed. That promise would necessarily include you, your family, and every person who came before and after you.
Okay.
It's often said that Matthew's gospel was written primarily for Jews or for those familiar with Jewish customs. However, I believe that if you read it carefully, as we are doing today, you're going to see that his vision, the author's vision, is far broader and much more grander in scope. So as we move into Matthew's birth narrative, the goal here is not to treat it as a historical puzzle that needs to be solved, but as a story that is being told in a very intentional way to a very specific audience. Matthew places Jesus squarely within a tradition of stories that endure by first grounding him in a genealogy that connects him to Abraham and David. In doing this, Matthew presents Jesus as someone who is deeply rooted in Israel's story while also extending far beyond it. Read on its own terms and within its first century context, this story would have made immediate sense to Jewish listeners and at the same time offered hope and meaning to non-Jewish hearers as well. This is the kind of story that doesn't just inform, but resonates, a story that invites people in and earns its place among those narratives that continue to be told because they are experienced as good news for all people.
Now, can you tell us about the star and its significance and how an ancient audience would have understood that?
We're going to discuss the star, commonly known as the Star of Bethlehem. This happens in Matthew chapter 2. He introduces two important elements in the birth narrative. The first one is the star that appears after Jesus is born, and the Magi, or wise men, who observe it.
Okay.
I want to separate those two elements and spend some time with each of them individually.
The star and the Magi.
The star and the Magi.
Okay.
As I said at the outset, our goal is not to rush past the details of this story, but to explore how this story would have been heard by an ancient audience already familiar with these kinds of narrative devices. When you slow down and look at each element on its own, you begin to see how Matthew is shaping his story in ways that would have felt both familiar and meaningful to the people hearing it for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Stars and other types of celestial phenomena played an important role in the ancient world, particularly in the ancient Near East, which we discussed in our previous episode. They were commonly used in biographies or lives, as I mentioned earlier, as narrative signals to mark the birth or rise of an important figure. To an ancient audience, these signs were not decorative details. They were meaningful symbols that communicated significance, authority, and destiny, letting the listener know that the person being introduced was someone worth paying attention to. So, you did some research. Let's briefly talk about a few examples from the ancient world whose birth was also accompanied by celestial phenomena or their rise to power.
So the first person I came across was Alexander the Great. Ancient sources report that Alexander's conception and birth were accompanied by extraordinary signs. Plutarch describes dreams and omens associated with his parents, and later traditions linked celestial phenomena to his destiny. In the Hellenistic world, Alexander's greatness was retroactively read back into the heavens, presenting him as someone marked out by the cosmos itself. Stars and omens functioned here as narrative shorthand for world-changing significance. The next one was Augustus. Augustus provides one of the clearest parallels. He was the first Roman emperor, the figure who transformed Rome from a republic into an empire, and Roman writers tell us that a brilliant comet appeared after the death of Julius Caesar. Augustus interpreted this comet as Caesar's soul ascending into the heavens. This so-called Julian star quickly became part of Augustus's propaganda, reinforcing the idea that his rule carried divine favor and legitimacy. Even though the comet appears after Caesar's death, Augustus's own birth and rise are framed within a broader cosmic story that links imperial authority directly to the heavens.
Interesting.
Yeah. And the last one I found was Mithridates the Sixth. Is that how you say that?
I think so.
So he was a powerful king of Pontus and a near contemporary of Jesus. Ancient sources claim that his birth was marked by remarkable celestial signs, including the appearance of a comet or star, and that similar signs appeared again at the beginning of his reign. These details present Mithridates as a ruler with an exceptional destiny, someone chosen and protected by cosmic forces. This kind of storytelling was especially common in the Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, where the heavens were often used to signal the significance of a king long before he ever took the throne.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, these are just a few examples, I'm sure, among many. But the point we're trying to make is that the appearance of a star at the birth of Jesus would have immediately resonated with the original audience of Matthew's gospel.
Yeah.
By this time, the world had been thoroughly Hellenized, meaning that it was saturated with Greek and Roman culture. Even Jewish audiences at this point, to a certain extent, would have been familiar with the stories, symbols, and myths of Greece and Rome. So, against that backdrop, a star announcing the birth of an important figure would not have sounded strange or out of place to the original audience. It would have sounded meaningful and worthy of the listener or reader's attention.
What else would celestial phenomena like the star signify in literature from the ancient world?
Another important detail about stars and other celestial phenomena is that they marked an impending regime change. The scholar David M. Litwa, who specializes in ancient Mediterranean religions, early Christianity, and Greco-Roman literature, says this: in ancient literature, strange stellar phenomena often signified regime change. The phenomenon means either that a new king is to be born or that another king is going to rule. Weird astral events were thus associated with coups, events that inspired real boldness among renegades and genuine terror in rulers. I'm going to be including his book in the references at the end in the description of the episode. It's an amazing book, worth reading if you're even remotely interested in these things. As you could see, it's no surprise that Matthew says that when Herod heard the news about the star from the Magi, it says that he was frightened and all Jerusalem with him. Matthew chapter 2, verse 3, because the people living at that time, they knew that these celestial events signified impending regime change or the birth of a new king who would soon replace the current king.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very interesting.
That's pretty good.
So when we step back and put all of this together, the star in Matthew's birth narrative starts to look far less like a strange or random detail and far more like a carefully chosen signal. In the ancient world, stars and other celestial phenomena regularly marked the birth or rise of important figures. And stories about Alexander, Augustus, and Mithridates show us that the heavens were often used to announce significance, authority, and destiny. By the time Matthew is writing, the world is thoroughly Hellenized, and even Jewish audiences would have been familiar with this symbolic language. A star announcing a birth would immediately tell the listener that something important is happening. More than that, ancient audiences understood unusual astral events as signs of impending regime change, the rise of a new ruler and the threat this posed to existing power structures. That is why Matthew tells us that Herod was frightened when he heard about the star. The heavens were speaking, and what they were announcing was not just a birth, but a challenge to the way the world was currently ordered.
All right, so now to our final section, the Magi. Who were these Magi that came to worship Jesus, and what would they represent to an ancient audience?
Now, the Magi are, in my view, one of the most interesting elements in Matthew's birth narrative.
Why is that?
For a few reasons, but the first thing that needs to be said is that the term Magi comes from the Greek magoi or magos, which is where we get words like magic or magician. In fact, in Spanish, the word for magician or wizard is mago, which seems to basically take it almost directly from the Greek. The term is sometimes translated as wise men.
Yeah, that's the term I've always heard.
In the translations, they use wise men.
Okay.
But calling them kings comes from much later Christian tradition. You know, like there's that celebration of the Three Kings Day.
Yeah.
It's a popular celebration, but it's inaccurate and misleading because these were not kings. These were magi. And other possible ways to translate the word magi includes wizard, magician, astrologer, sorcerer, or diviner. Remember, astrologer, diviner, that's exactly what they're doing when they're in the east and they see that star rise in the west. They're interpreting these celestial activities. And then to them, it's telling them that the new king of the Jews has been born.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yep. Now, that detail is important because within the biblical text itself, these kinds of practices are often treated with suspicion or just outright hostility. Deuteronomy 18, verse 9 through 14, for example, explicitly condemns sorcerers and diviners, calling these practices abhorrent. Isaiah 47:13-14 even goes so far as to mock those who claim to read the heavens and interpret the stars.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting that Matthew
Why were
selects
they
these
chosen?
characters to be the ones that recognize what's going on based on how they're reading the stars.
Huh.
Which is why, like I said, I think it's striking that Matthew uses the Magi for that particular purpose. The Magi are basically pagan figures. They're outsiders. They're people engaged in practices that the biblical text in other parts criticizes. And yet, they're the ones who correctly read the stars and recognize that the true king of the Jews has been born. Matthew intentionally flips expectations here. I really like what he does, because the people you would least expect to understand what God is doing are the ones who actually understand what God is doing, while those who should recognize it, the so-called king of the Jews and the scribes and the priests who assist them, they feel threatened by it.
Yeah. That's interesting. It's almost as if like they're out of place. Like you said, it seems like Matthew selected this narrative device intentionally. Like it wasn't an accident.
No, I definitely don't think it's an accident. Correct. So definitely not an accident, but the more important question is this, what we've been saying through the whole episode. What would Matthew's original audience have understood when they heard the word Magi? The Magi were not Jewish sages or monarchs. They were priests from a different religious tradition altogether. Outsiders whose presence in the story would have immediately signaled to the reader or the listener far more provocative than a sentimental visit from three royal figures. They're priests from an ancient religion known as Zoroastrianism. Now, Zoroastrianism is an ancient Persian religion centered on Ahura Mazda. It teaches that the universe is shaped by an ongoing moral struggle between truth and falsehood, or good and evil. It emphasizes human responsibility, ethical choice, and the hope that good ultimately prevails through right action, right thought, and right speech. Most scholars agree that Judaism encountered Zoroastrian ideas during the Babylonian exile and the later Persian period, when the Judeans lived under Persian rule. In that context, themes like a more developed angelic world, sharper moral dualism, and clearer expectations of resurrection and final judgment begin to take shape within Jewish thought. These ideas were not borrowed wholesale, so to say. They were reworked and absorbed into Israel's existing theological framework and commitments. Again, going back to our previous episode, episode 3, they incorporate some of these ideas that they pick up into their own traditions.
Yeah.
And you could, again, if you follow the theology as it develops from Genesis through Revelation, you see these waves, you see these markings, kind of like a graph on a electrocardiogram or something. You can see where something's happening, right? And if you can connect it historically, which is fascinating to me.
I literally pictured that. You brought it to my level.
Yeah. Now, an interesting side note, by the late Second Temple period, many Jews held messianic expectations centered on a divinely appointed figure known as the Messiah, who would restore Israel, defeat oppressive powers, and set the world right through God's justice. Interestingly enough, Zoroastrianism likewise anticipated a future savior figure, often called the Saosant, who would defeat evil, raise the dead, and bring about the final renewal of creation. In both traditions, Judaism and Zoroastrianism, the hope was not to escape from the world, but its moral and cosmic restoration through decisive divine action in history. Which reminds me of the Lord's Prayer. When Jesus teaches his disciples how to pray, he says, "Let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." So there's that idea of bringing heaven to earth is in the Lord's Prayer. And it's a hope that had developed by the Second Temple period within Judaism and Zoroastrianism.
Hmm.
Another thing worth keeping in mind is that Jews at the time of Jesus likely held a somewhat positive memory of Persian rule and, by extension, Persian culture, which includes Zoroastrianism. Persian culture and Zoroastrianism was now embodied in the Parthian kingdom, which is the area that these magi are arriving from. It says that they arrived from the east, and the Parthian kingdom was to the east of Israel.
Okay.
The biblical text itself reflects this posture of positive sentiment towards Persian culture and Zoroastrianism, as I mentioned earlier, when the biblical text refers to Cyrus the Great as God's anointed one in Isaiah 45:1.
Okay.
That's a title that's normally reserved for Israel's own kings and later will be applied to Jesus. Remember when he comes out of the waters during his baptism, the heavens open up and God says, "This is my son, whom I have chosen." It's the same as saying the anointed one, the chosen one.
Okay.
That kind of language signals gratitude for Persian policy, even while maintaining clear boundaries around Jewish belief and practice. Now, around the time of Jesus, Judea was caught between two imperial powers, Rome to the west and the Parthian Empire to the east. The area was strategic but unstable because of this conflict between the two empires. After a brief Parthian takeover of Jerusalem in 40 BCE, Rome reasserted control by installing Herod the Great as a client king and kicking out the Parthian-installed king Antigonus II Mattathias, the last Hasmonean ruler, securing loyalty but fueling local resentment. By Jesus' lifetime, Roman dominance was firm, yet shaped by memories of foreign rule, imperial violence, and heightened expectations that God would act decisively within history. This is why Herod is, in the biblical text in the New Testament, is a very disliked figure.
Yeah.
Because the Jews of the time always saw him as an illegitimate king. They saw him as a pawn of the Roman Empire. So he was placed by Rome as king of Judea. Now, if you recall from the Old Testament, the Jewish kings were always selected by God and prophets. This is a king that gets placed by the Roman Empire. So when the Magi arrive in Jerusalem and ask Herod where the king of the Jews is to be born, you can safely assume that this most likely sent chills down his spine. This is Herod the Great, a ruler who had just recently secured his throne with the help of Rome after deposing the Parthian-installed king in Judea, Antigonus II Mattathias. Now here come Magi from Parthia, the very region associated with that threat, where Antigonus II Mattathias was from, telling Herod that they have seen a sign in the heavens announcing the birth of the true king of the Jews.
Oh my God.
That's powerful.
The true king of
So-
Jews.
Now, his psychotic reaction makes sense
Yeah.
because when they don't come back to tell him where they found the king of the Jews, he just says, go and kill every 2-year-old and under
Yeah.
boy because he can't take that risk.
Wow.
The irony is thick. These magi, coming from the east, have correctly interpreted the star, but they don't know who the king actually is supposed to be or where he's supposed to be born. They're just following the star, the activity of the star.
Yeah.
Geography and Jewish scripture are not their areas of expertise. This is why Matthew has them stop in Jerusalem. To find the location, Herod must consult the chief priests and scribes, the ones who know the texts, the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures. The outsiders read the heavens correctly, while the insiders read the scriptures correctly. The story only moves forward when both are brought together, and that tension is exactly what Matthew wants us to notice before the Magi are finally led to Bethlehem, to the house where Jesus is born.
I've never looked at it that way. So what else do we know about these magi and their roles in the ancient world?
Well, in the ancient Near East, the Magi also functioned as court advisors, especially in matters tied to kingship and destiny. Their presence at the rise or installation of a ruler or a king signaled that the new king's reign was cosmically sanctioned, aligned with the order of the heavens rather than merely political power. To ancient audiences, Magi did not show up for ordinary births. They showed up when history was turning a corner. And boy, oh boy, did history turn a corner when Jesus of Nazareth was born.
Wow, that's amazing. I love how the more you know about the context in which these stories were written, the more they open up and become more meaningful and inspiring. At the beginning, you mentioned that we would talk about Abraham later in the episode. Do you want to talk about that now?
Yes. So to conclude this section, I do want to circle back to Abraham. At the beginning of the episode, I mentioned that we would return to him, and this is why. I noted earlier that the author of Matthew intentionally traces Jesus' ancestry back to Abraham, and we already explored one of the reasons, the promise God made to him that through him, all the families of the earth would be blessed. Now, the reason I think this is intentional, tracing him back to Abraham, is because if you compare Matthew's genealogy to Luke's genealogy, and this is the only time in this episode that I'm going to mention Luke, because I really think that we need to respect each author's intention, you'll see that Luke traces Jesus' genealogy or ancestry all the way back to Adam and Eve.
Okay.
So Matthew, I think, intentionally stops at Abraham because he's trying to make a point here. And this is what I'm going to talk about now.
Okay.
And I think it's because there is another reason. And it connects directly to the Magi from the east who see the star and come to worship the child Jesus. So in Matthew chapter 2, verse 2, the word translated as worship literally means to fall down on one's knees. It's a gesture of recognizing royalty and, in some contexts, divinity. Now, here's the part that's easy to miss if you're not paying attention. Abraham, who originally was called Abram, was called by God out of a place known as Ur of the Chaldeans. You can read about that in Genesis chapter 11, verse 27 to 31. Now, if you look at the map that I'm going to show on screen right now, you're going to notice that Ur of the Chaldeans sits almost directly 600 to 700 miles east of Bethlehem, where Jesus has just been born and the Magi arrived to kneel before him. So you can almost draw a straight line going east from Bethlehem right across the desert to Ur of the Chaldeans. The route Abraham would have taken from Ur to Canaan, which later becomes Israel, is the same route the Magi would have traveled to reach Bethlehem.
Oh, wow.
Going straight across would have meant crossing desert and wilderness. So both journeys follow the same arc through the Fertile Crescent, which we discussed a little bit in our last episode. It's the Levante, or that area where it's fertile, and the kingdoms would always go through Israel because it was right in the middle of that area, and going through the desert was too difficult and too risky. I don't think that this is accidental. I think Matthew is doing something very intentional here. He's not only connecting Jesus to Abraham through genealogy, but also honoring Abraham by having figures from the east, from the land Abraham once left behind, come to witness the fulfillment of the promise God made to him. The story comes full circle. What began in Ur to the east now finds its fulfillment in a small town called Bethlehem. When we take all of this together, the Magi and the star stop looking like sentimental Christmas imagery and start looking like a carefully constructed theological and political statement. Matthew deliberately brings pagan astrologer priests from the east, people associated with foreign power, suspect practices, and cosmic interpretation, and places them at the center of the story as the ones who correctly recognize that a new king has been born. They read the heavens rightly, while the insiders felt threatened, and the existing ruler panics because of the stars, the Magi, and the kingship all pointed to regime change. At the same time, Matthew quietly ties this moment back to Abraham, whose journey began in the east and carried a promise that all the families of the earth would be blessed. The route Abraham once walked is echoed by the path the Magi now travel, kneeling where that promise finally takes flesh in Bethlehem. What Matthew gives us is a story where the heavens announce it, outsiders recognize it, power fears it, and history turns a corner.
Oh my God.
The star is not decoration, it's a signal that something old is ending and something entirely new has begun.
Wow, that was beautiful. That was beautifully stated. So I'm going to give a little recap. When we pull everything together, what Matthew gives us is not a sentimental origin story, but a carefully crafted narrative designed to make sense to a first century audience living under empire, saturated in symbolic language, and waiting for God to act. By grounding Jesus in a genealogy that ties him to Abraham and David, Matthew establishes both continuity with Israel's story and a promise that extends beyond it. By placing a star in the heavens, he signals significance and regime change in a way ancient listeners would immediately recognize. And by centering pagan magi from the east as the ones who rightly interpret that sign, Matthew flips expectations, showing that outsiders recognize what insiders fear. The journey of the Magi echoes the journey of Abraham, bringing the story full circle, from promise to fulfillment. This is how the birth of Jesus would have been heard, as an announcement that history is turning, that power is being redefined, and that what began quietly in Bethlehem is nothing less than the good news for all people.
All right. Now, as I mentioned in our last episode, I'm going to be including references in the episode description. So if anyone is interested in exploring these topics further, which I highly recommend that you do, those references are going to be very helpful. I really believe that there's no better way to worship God than by using our brains, by trying to understand things, by exploring the science behind things with our God-given intellectual abilities. I always like to remind people that if God created the universe, then the human brain is the crown jewel of that creation. And there's no better way to honor him than by using it to the best of our abilities. That includes all areas of life, including matters of faith and scripture. So if you want to honor God this week, grab a book, learn something new, or unlearn something old. But whatever you do, exercise your intellect as a way to honor God.
That was beautiful. Thanks for listening and have a Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.